10 years in the east of London. And then that's when you decided to found or to start writing. First you start writing on education, science-based or evidence-based education. And this became an organization called Research.ed. And since 2013, you have been giving conferences and talks all over the world on this topic. You're also an author. One of your books is Running the Room, which is a sort of a guide for teachers. And hello again, thank you for joining us. We have about 40 minutes or 45 minutes to discuss a very thorough and complex topic, which is education itself and then science-based education. Could you, for a start, could you just give us a resume of what is this idea of Research.ed, this project that you've created and have been disseminating all over the world? Just a resume of what you do and the idea of the project.
Thank you. I will, Sarah. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Research.ed started in the UK when I was a teacher, because of the frustration I felt for the lack of evidence and scientific instruction, which was in the way we taught, the way we understood children learning, and so on. Want to ask people if they wanted to help me put together a conference where we could meet and discuss and talk about research and science and education. And I was awake until 3 o'clock in the morning, responding to calls from people who were hungry to do this. So we started to put on conferences, first of all in London, but then and then eventually around the world. Teachers, administrators, principals, leaders, politicians, scientists, researchers, under one roof, and to have a conversation about what we felt was the best evidence we had up until that point. Because the big problem, as far as I could see in the United Kingdom, was that much of what we did in schools and a lot of how we taught children was based on folk teaching, you know, like folk magic or folk medicine. That this was like homeopathy. It was based on intuition, instinct, what people thought, our emotions, and so on. Almost like a religion. Which isn't to say there wasn't a lot of fantastic teaching going on. There was. But I noticed, even as an early teacher, that you could say anything in education, and somebody would say, yeah, that's a great idea. And that's not good enough. The education of children and the way we train teachers is far too important to be left to faith and intuition and instinct. And that's why I started Research.ed several years ago. And so far, it shows no sign of stopping. And we go all around the world now. And the pandemic hasn't stopped us. We had an online series of lectures during the lockdowns. And there is a real hunger amongst educators around the world to, not just for research, but for evidence-informed practice. Because once you take the toothpaste out of the tube, they can't go back in again. You know, we're not going backwards now.
Once you see it, you cannot unsee it, right? That's, I think that's a phrase that you use. Once you see it, you cannot. During this year, we hear about pseudoscience all the time. We have never heard so much about evidence-based decisions, but it's always in the context of medicine or biological sciences, never about education. Why do you think, or it has never been about education, or at least till your project started, why do you think that governments, teachers, associates, and have never thought about it, never considered it should also be based in education? No one would go to, or some people do, but conventional medicine would never work without evidence-based, at least nowadays. It's how we see it. But why is it that there is this dissociation in education between science, what is evidence-based, and hunches, as you call it?
That's an excellent question. Let me tell you a very short story to answer it. 100 years ago, before medicine was transformed by understanding evidence and empirical science, medicine was an incredibly dangerous thing to participate in if you were a patient. Hundreds of years ago, it was only in the 20th century that meeting a doctor would have more chance of curing you than killing you. And hundreds of years ago, there was a very famous incident when doctors themselves resisted the influence of science into medicine because, and I quote, they believed that they knew their patients and that nobody could know their patients better than them.
Yeah.
And there was a very famous incident where in a particular maternity ward where women were giving birth, lots of children and women were dying, and they couldn't work out why. And they found out that the surgeons, the male surgeons delivering the children in those days, had recently been dissecting cadavers and bringing, of course, all of the and bacteria with them. And when it was suggested to them that maybe they should wash their hands, they responded, "Our hands are clean. We are gentlemen." To me, indicates how strongly even medicine resisted the introduction of science. When science tells you something you don't want to hear, it will be resisted. And nation is an ideological battlefield where the desires and the ethics and the morality of what we want for children is fought over generation after generation. And so it's no surprise that the high priests of education resist sometimes the input of science, because sometimes it tells us things that we don't want to hear.
So it's a matter of delay. So it's sort of a reproduction of what already happened in medicine, in the medical field. Now is happening in education. You've been around the world, as I said, and as you mentioned. What kind of problems do you face or teachers face, and how common are they? Or are there particular problems of European teachers or Mediterranean teachers versus Northern Europe teachers? How common what are the most common problems, and what are there specific problems of specific areas of the globe?
I think that's, again, another excellent question, because one of the things that sometimes we do very badly is to learn from one another. And one of the things I find by visiting schools in South Africa, Australia, Santiago, Chicago, whatever, it's how common the dilemmas and the challenges that face and learners. And I think the reason why this shouldn't surprise us is because human beings are human beings. The brain is the brain and the mind is the mind. The way we learn is very strongly constrained by our biology and our biochemistry and our neurology, and that this is an international thing. And so when you have children in a classroom and attempt to teach them, the same problems and challenges emerge whether you are teaching in Timbuktu or Birmingham or Lisbon. The same things arise: curriculum, assessment, motivation, focus, behavior, time and time again. And what I find very interesting is that different countries do things very, very different, but they are all constrained in many, many ways. So the same questions arise whenever I go to different countries. What is the best way to assess a child? How do we know when somebody has learned something? What is the best way to convey information? What is the best way to structure a curriculum? How can I make sure children are focused and motivated on the work? And these questions, as I say, which is why I find it very useful for teachers in particular to lean more heavily on cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, and so on, things which are universal to the human condition. Context matters, and culture definitely matters, but I think it matters a lot less than sometimes we think.
And you've mentioned the problems. Could you make some reference to the most common mistakes? I don't know if you can put it this way, but the most common ideas that are practiced all over the world by teachers and educators that are very, very different or in opposite directions of what science or what the evidence is.
Absolutely.
Right now.
Absolutely. So there are some really basic teachers are starting to look at, which is very exciting. Cognitive and the difference between novice and expert learners. Let me very quickly explain. Load theory comes from the work of people like Sweller from the University of Melbourne. Basically this idea that we can only think about one or two things at a time. We're not very good at multitasking. And in order for us to learn things and put them into our long-term memory...
Sorry, Tom, not ready to what? We have poor sound here. Not ready to?
I can't remember where that went, but I'll go back a little bit. That human beings can only focus on one or two things at once.
Oh, okay.
And also...
Children should only be taught one or two things at once. Is that what you said?
Well, in lots of classrooms around the world, what we see is teachers who want their children to learn, but they end up giving them very complex tasks. We would sometimes call this discovery learning, independent learning. They'll give children who know nothing about a subject lots of complex things to do, maybe a project, or they'll ask them to work in a group and say, you know, you're going to build this knowledge together. This is the best way to learn. But it isn't, because everything we know about psychology suggests that children and people focus on one thing at a time, or one or two things at a time. And if you say to a child who knows nothing about, say, the Holocaust, go and investigate the Holocaust, bring me a poster about the Holocaust, as I did, you shouldn't be surprised if children who know nothing about the Holocaust go to Google, type in the Holocaust, and write up the first thing they see, because they have no knowledge or background understanding of critical thinking, of looking at the internet, of you know, World War II, and so on. And what was children who came up with lots of posters about the Holocaust didn't happen. Now, that's what happens when you give novices too much to do. And there is a very, very big in education for independent learning, for group learning, project work, for thematic work. Now, all the evidence suggests that this is not the best way to teach children, and that they can learn from this when they are good at a topic, when they know a lot about a topic. And this feeds in to what I call the 21st century skills or 21st century learning agenda. Everybody loves this. But the problem is, it's more novelty and glamour than actual science or evidence about how children learn. And the big danger is a rush to create schools where children are all doing things off by themselves and working in groups and doing projects, that we actually create a situation where they'll far less than they would have done, simply because we think, oh, this must be the right way to learn. But there's no just that it is. And this is one of the biggest mistakes we make in the UK, but internationally also as well.
Do you, when you have feedback, I assume you have feedback from the teachers that attend your conferences and the teachers that you work with. What are the main benefits once they see, as you said, once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and when they start bringing these evidence-based practices to the classroom, what are the main benefits? Is it in behavior? Is it in the speed of learning? Is it, what is the feedback that they give you?
When we start to use evidence to inform our practice as teachers, almost every aspect of what we do improves, because it relies more on efficient methods, useful methods, rather than simply things we've guessed, things we think, and you know, and this is progresses. So the people who come to our conferences and the people who utilize more evidence, start to read more about what the evidence says in education, very commonly that they suddenly understand how they need to sequence the lessons, when they should teach things, when reteach things, when they should explain things, and so on. And then one of the main benefits, children who most benefit from this approach are the children who are already the most disadvantaged, the children who are the furthest behind. And I think this is a wonderful justice issue for education, because one of the things we really want to do is to make sure that all children learn, but also particularly the children suffer the most in life, the children with the least advantage. And when we use evidence, we find that children remember more, they learn more, they enjoy it more, they learn fast. And you can also employ evidence-informed practices to things like behaviour and how to make children become motivated and focus on their work. So there are 100 benefits to be accrued from using evidence, and there is nothing but heartache to be gained from not using evidence.
And do these benefits, are they more evident in younger children, preschool, in whatever grade, or is it the same? Or is it always beneficial to start using evidence-based education? So I don't know if I made my point very well. Did you get it? Is it the same to start at 5-year-old kindergarten or at 11th grade?
Yeah. I think the simple answer to that is that it's never the wrong time to stop doing, you know, and and that, to be honest, the earlier you can get into this, the better, because a child who has had a poor education from kindergarten all the way up to maybe the age of 12 or 13, who then gets high quality teachers. I mean, that's great. They're going to get 4, 5, 6 years of high quality education, but how much better if in the foundational years of education, when students are being introduced to gateway skills and competencies like literacy and numeracy, you know, how much better for them to receive that at the beginning of their learning careers than right at the end of it. It's not to fix things, but oh my goodness, there's a suppose.
You're also a father, you've already mentioned. Do you use these studies, this evidence, as a father, or is it only about formal education?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there is no area of life where evidence cannot support doing something a little bit better. I would be a fraud if I'm to use this in my own personal career. Let me give you an example. Several years ago, my daughter wanted to learn to read, and I wanted her to read. And I sat down with her thinking, I will teach you how to read. Got the basic books, and then I realized I didn't know how to teach reading. Now, this may not be surprising, but I write books. I write and I speak for a living. And yet I cannot teach how to do the simplest aspect of that. And this reminds me that of what is sometimes called the curse of knowledge, the curse of the expert. And it's a very well-known phenomenon whereby when you are good at something, like, you know, you and I are good at writing or speaking, you know, we are professionals. But you often forget how hard it is to do basics when you are not good at it. And this is from the work of Professor Paul Kirchner, the difference between a novice and an expert learner. And so in order to teach a novice, you have to think like a novice and ask yourself, what am I really asking them to do? So I read the research on phonics, for example, reading instruction, and it taught me that children need to begin with to recognize the alphabet. They need to recognize phonemes, the common sounds, you know, of the language. Then they need to put these phonemes together. And then they need to understand meanings of words. And then they need to understand grammar and syntax and so on. But you build from the bottom up. Like in mathematics, you build from numbers to arithmetic, to algebra, to calculus. And so, you know, you start at the beginning and go. And this, for me, really transformed how I taught my children. And it's no surprise that when you are a parent who has got the time to spend time with your children, and I wish everyone did, you can give your child massive advantages in education by patiently unpacking these foundational educational skills with children. But the sad fact is that not enough teachers are instructed in these methods themselves. And sometimes some early years, or we would say primary or junior teachers, aren't exposed to enough of these evidence-informed methods. And it's not their fault. The system doesn't support teachers enough to access evidence. And I think that's a real shame and something we can do.
I'm going to make a sort of a confession about your life, but I don't think, about your private life, I don't think you will mind, because when we had the conversation, the preparation conversation for this one, you had your kids in the house, and you had to interrupt because they were having a fight or something. And so you didn't look like a zero tolerance father. That's why I was asking if you applied these ideas too, because you are known and criticized for your supposedly zero tolerance in the for behavioral problems in the classroom. You're called the czar of education, and they don't mean it in an apologetic way. It's not a compliment. Would you like to defend yourself, or you are proud, or on the other hand, you are proud to be called the czar of education, or that your ideas are zero tolerance ideas?
There's a lot of questions there. Okay, let me address this. I am proud to advise the UK government on behaviour, because as a teacher, as an ex-teacher, who wouldn't want to have that kind of access to trying to make things better? So I don't care if it's called czar or not. I mean, czar is something the press called it. I wish I was a czar. I have no power. I'm an advisor.
It was the Guardian. Well, it was the Guardian calling you the czar of education. Yeah. So
the Guardian called me a czar. And then they criticized me for being a czar. Anyway, when it comes to zero tolerance, I've got nothing to defend there, because I don't believe that zero tolerance is a very helpful phrase, and I've never defended it. And the only people who seem to think it's associated with me are people who don't read anything ever right. So I don't care what they think, because social media is full of opinion, and it's very rarely informed, so we just have to live with this. But if I can focus on zero tolerance, the reason why I think zero tolerance is a very unhelpful thing is that if you have a rule, no fighting or something like this, and it is universal, there are no exceptions to your rule, you usually find that your rule is cruel and inhuman. So if you have a rule against killing, for example, which is a fairly common rule, even in Scotland, where I am right now, but there are exceptions to this. Self-defense, acts of war, and so on. It's absurd to say, you must never kill. Now, going back to the school, zero tolerance for behaviours. If you say there are no excuses for behaviours, this is insane. Because if you have a child, if you say we have zero tolerance for late homework, you must bring in your homework on time, and then the child says, I was hit by a bus today, and if you would still say to that child, then you're insane and you shouldn't be allowed to go. So zero tolerance is a very unhelpful term. I think low tolerance is a very helpful term, and it's much better because it allows us to be human. And there's one small last thing I'll say about zero tolerance, which is this. Maybe there are some things we need to be zero tolerance about. I worked in a school once where one of the students sexually assaulted a teacher. Now, to my mind, there is no reason for this. We don't think, I wonder what we should do. Obviously, we can think about making sure that the child is to the right place, a high-quality destination, along with making sure that they are reported to the legal authorities. But there are some things that maybe schools should never tolerate. Abuse, bringing in a gun, using a knife on stuff, So I think we have to be much more careful about how we use this. I don't think it's a helpful term, that's why.
But there has been some teachers' organizations that have been against the ideas that you defend and have called it inhumane, and they argue that behavioral problems in England are rising, so apparently something is not working, or do you think that it would be even worse if that hasn't been done? Because you're a counselor for the minister, if I'm not mistaken. So I assume some of your ideas have been are taking place in the classrooms. And recent data show that behavioral problems are rising in England. I'm not sure if England or UK, if the data was for England or UK. What is happening?
I think that's not true.
Okay.
I don't think there's any evidence to suggest the behaviour is getting worse in England or the UK. What we see, because traditionally it's been really hard to track behaviour at a national level, because the way we inspect schools doesn't really record behaviour in that way. I mean, it's easy for an inspector to say behaviour is good or bad or something else, but nationally, the picture is that more than 85% of schools in the UK say they have good or better behaviour. I don't believe that. I think behaviour is a really big problem in UCs. But I only the impact that some people think I had, that only in the last 2 or 3 years has the UK government started to roll out some small training packages in behaviour. And good, I'm glad. But it's only been in the last couple of years. I published a report a few years ago, which some head teachers have used, and I think they find very useful. But again, this isn't big. Some program which is rolled out. So I only wish I had that level of impact. And secondly, behaviour has not been getting worse in the UK because nobody knows. And one of the ways I suggest we try to address this is by having what I call the National Behaviour Survey, where once a year we survey students and staff to anonymously let us know how they feel about behaviour in their school, 1 to 10, do they feel trained, do they feel safe, and so on. If we could do that, we could have a very, very accurate how people feel about behaviour across the whole UK, across England at least. So that's something I'm trying to make happen. We'll see if it does happen.
Is there any evidence so far of of the impact the pandemic might have had on children, or it's too soon? Still don't have time to analyze the data and have.
It's a great question. It's a great question. It's very hard to put your finger in and say, this is how things are now, because as you imply there, it's it normally takes time to see the feedback from the circumstances. We know, for example, I mean, there were lots of government investigations into how schools, how children and staff were doing. And of course, understandably, they found that teachers are more stressed, they're more worried, they feel like their jobs are harder, they're more worried about the future, they're less secure in their salaries, things that we could probably have guessed, if I'm honest. What I think is very interesting is that a lot of people want to claim that children are undergoing some enormous mental health crisis just now. And the problem is they may be or they may not be, but we don't have the data on this yet. And I think it's very irresponsible to do this. I think what was very interesting was that in England, certainly, when we had our big lockdowns, and then we started gradually allow children to go back to school, the children were dying to go back to school. This was, they really wanted to
learn to appreciate more of school, right?
Yes, and they appreciate the fact that they find so much meaning in relationships with their peer groups, but also we get that quite a lot of children rather like school, because they find meaning and purpose in it. I'm not saying they love it, but they like to do things which are meaningful and make them feel valued. So, there are some things like this we've got some data on, but I think it will take another couple of years for us to really find out what the lasting impact has been concentrated in the children who are already disadvantaged. And again, perhaps this is an obvious thing to say, but children who come from challenging circumstances or children who are already very weak at their subjects will fall back even more when they have to rely on their own initiative on the computer to keep up. Children like this will fall further behind. So we could have probably guessed this, but I think we've got a very strong sense that the disadvantage gap is getting wider and wider and wider.
Mm-hmm. Now that you've mentioned disadvantaged children, when we discussed same problems everywhere in the world. I don't think you've mentioned any supposedly difference between public and private schools. Does it make sense to talk about it, public versus private schools, or again, it's the same problems, it's all about human beings and teachers and students?
Well, because these are the only things that we teach. Well, perhaps you can tell me otherwise. But what we find very interesting is that the demographic of the children who inhabit the independent sector tend to come from, unsurprisingly, more advanced, wealthier backgrounds, from circumstances where they tend to receive more literacy, more numeracy, more socialization, more social capital, more cultural capital. Again, this surprises nobody. People who have a lot have a lot more than other people, and that includes the social benefits which accrue. And one of the things that we found during, for instance, lockdown, was independent school children fell behind far less than children in this time. But this isn't because they're better or because the schools are better. It's because those children are already more capable and able, and therefore more capable of learning independently. That's one. And number two, was the schools have so much more resources that they normally found it a lot easier to transfer their curriculum online because they had flexibility to do so. They had staff, they had more staff than they need, and so on. But a lot of state schools, because of funding problems, they are, I'll use a phrase, they run hot. They run hot. You know, they're going as fast as they can. They don't have any accommodation for emergency beyond that because they're already doing as much as they can. And a lot of them to set up online learning like this because it's hard. It was an incredibly new thing. I don't blame teachers for really struggling with this. So there was a big noticeable difference between the children who went through the independent sector versus children who went through the state sector.
There's also different, you're from Scotland, right? You're Scottish. And from what I understood, the educational system in Scotland is quite different from the system in England, or right? England or the rest of the UK?
Yeah.
Could you please refer to each of the systems and say what your opinion is on each of it and what is the best one?
I mean, that's not fair. I should say that the English system is very different from the Scottish, Welsh, and the Northern Irish system, the other three of the United Kingdom. And so it's probably easier just to put them into two groups. But of course, it's slightly unfair because there are still lots of differences. I would say that what we would call the Celtic systems, the Welsh and the Irish systems, they have been reinvented fairly recently, within the last 10 or 15 years. There has been a big push in these systems to completely rethink and reinvent those systems. In my opinion, not successfully. And what they've done is they have leaned far too heavily into sales that some people believe about education, like children are natural learners and we just have to let them decide what to learn, and that they'll behave if we give them things which are interesting, and that we should let them pick what they want to learn and when they want to learn it, and they should in groups, and they should learn things through projects, and they should learn things across different disciplines, and so on. So these systems, the Celtic systems, to my mind, have gone in exactly the direction. And we've seen, for instance, in Scotland, and it pains me to say this because it's one of the countries I love most, we have seen literacy and numeracy decline and decline and decline in Scotland. So much so, and this is a small political point, that the Scottish government has stopped participating in international tests of things like literacy and numeracy because, well, who knows why? They say it's to save money. But in reality, to my experience, it's because the educational standards are declining so much. Now, England is not this perfect, shining example. I assure you, in England, we do many things wrong. But I would say that it's on a better path. than a lot of the policy and strategy we've seen in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. I would say one last thing, though, before people try to set me on fire, which is that teachers working in the sector care just as much, want just as much for the children, and believe in them just as much, and are working just as hard. And I wish that in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, we had a greater emphasis on sequence curriculums, evidence-informed practice, phonics, good behaviour management, and so on and so on.
I think our time is running out. Unfortunately, because of technical problems, we have a bit less time that we were planning. To wrap it up, what would be an advice if somebody, if a teacher or a government would implement one measure, what would be it?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, I'm going to.
You can make a long sentences, so you can make 2 or 3.
I would get them to focus on teaching teachers how to manage behavior in their classroom. There is nothing more important, because behavior is everything that we do and affects everything that we do. So therefore, that's my one sentence: behavior. Everything else follows from that.
Okay. And just to finish with a personal question, do you miss your times as a teacher, and do you think you will go back?
Listen, I loved teaching. I loved it. It saved my life. It saved my sanity. I used to run nightclubs in Soho in London, and I loved it. But it's the kind of job that burns you like fuel. So glad I got out, and teaching made me sane. And I did it for 15 years. I feel like I've signed, but I feel like I can do even more by working at a structural systems level. And also I now train teachers, and I now train, and it gives me so much pleasure to see support like that working, and through things like research ed, helping teachers to become more evidence informed themselves. I miss teaching every day. I miss being in a classroom. I miss being with the children and talking to them and listening to them. I don't miss everything else associated with teaching. Anything outside the classroom, I don't miss that. I don't miss the paperwork. I don't miss the phone calls. I don't miss that. I miss the kids.
You don't miss the paperwork, do you?
No, I'm afraid not.
Yeah, that's a very common complaint. I hear that a lot. Okay, thank you, Tom. Thank you for joining.
It's been a real pleasure, Honor. Thank you very
much.
Thank you. I'm glad we got there in the end. And thank you to everyone who listened. Have a very good day.
Thank you.
As empresas não financeiras de Oeiras representam 24 mil milhões de euros de volume de negócios.